No, sir. Didn't like it. What's up, Internet? Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and the 5 things I hate about D&D, as well as 5 games that fix those problems. Now, I'll be the first to admit, hate is a strong word, and I don't really hate Dungeons & Dragons. It was the first, and there is a nugget of genius there, and I can't deny that. At the same time, honestly, it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, and I think that the fans who are there tend to over-exaggerate that it is perfect. I find a lot of times if I explain to a player that I'm not interested in D&D, I don't care for D&D as much as I would try other games, even retro clones over orthodox 5th ed. What I get from players is kind of this response of, oh my god, how do you not like Dungeons & Dragons? Well, obviously you've never played Dungeons & Dragons with me as DM, so you should try it with me as DM because I'll make sure that you understand why it's the greatest thing ever and you should love it, which it's kind of like the whole, well, what do you mean you don't like pizza? Well, you've never tried my pizza. You've got to try my pizza because it's the best. Is it still crust, cheese, and sauce, and some toppings? It's pizza. Same thing's true here. And the reverse, when I try talking players into another game, you know, let's try Runequest, let's try Forbidden Land, let's try something else. It's kind of that, yeah, but it's not Dungeons & Dragons. I don't want to try it. It's not Dungeons & Dragons. I'm loyal to D&D. And it always feels to me like, again, using another food analogy, the kid who is always eating at Taco Bell and that's the only Mexican they know, and then you bring them to a normal Mexican restaurant, an actual, you know, mom and pop place, and they're just like, oh, I don't want to try this, it looks disgusting, and what's this on the menu, pollo burrito? I don't want that, I don't want pollo, whatever that is, it sounds disgusting, give me a chicken burrito. That's what I want. Pollo is chicken, you know what I mean, man. And that's really where I feel a lot of times when confronted with Dungeons & Dragons over other RPGs. So one of the things, the reason I bring this up is because there are reasons I don't care for D&D. Now some of these have been fixed over time and I won't deny that, but I started with 1st ed and I played through 2nd ed. And about that time is when I started seeing other games. Actually right around the end of 1st ed, start of 2nd ed is when I started playing other RPGs. And I would still get this kind of, you know, pushback from players. How dare you? How dare you think that Runequest is any good? It doesn't even have the good art like Dungeons & Dragons. And that's really where my frustration has grown over time. And it has gotten infinitely stronger, I think, because of just the amounts of pushback I've received. It's always funny to me, too, when you hear a player say, well, you know, I'm loyal to D&D because it was first, and you know that same person is a PlayStation user, and you think, well, if you're only loyal to first, why aren't you playing Atari, man, or at least Nintendo? And I think a lot of that is, again, a role-playing game is a lot harder to get into. It's a lot more involved than pushing a button on a console. To that end, I'm going to go through my 5 things that I have issues with D&D, or have had issues with in the past, and games that I think have done a really good job of fixing them, most of which are in that same time frame. They're not something that, you know, like, well, of course, you know, Symbaroum is a much more modern RPG than D&D, than 1st ed D&D, so comparing the two is a little tougher, and I get that. So I'm going to try to keep this, at least games that are in that same line, if you will. So without any further ado, here's my top 5 problems I have with D&D and games that I think fix them. Number 5, the class system. D&D started as a miniatures game called Chainmail, and the hobby kind of evolved from it. If you look at the history of D&D, it's definitely tied to miniatures wargaming. And really the class system is a vestigial arm of this. It is something that's remained because of its connection to miniatures wargaming. I mean, if you look at a typical Napoleonics wargame, you know, most sides are going to have infantry for, you know, holding positions, cavalry for light strikes and fast attacks, artillery for being able to barrage a unit, and of course some sort of command and control to keep the units from failing morale checks and running away. And in D&D you have something very similar. You have the fighter, who is your upfront, kick the crap out of everything guy. You have your rogue or thief, who's there to do the backstabbing, light attacks, fast attacks, keep their enemy on his toes, if you will. And your mage is your artillery, throwing those huge fireballs and magic missiles and the like. And of course, then your cleric becomes your command and control. Instead of it being keeping together with morale, maybe keeping together with inspirations or with actual healing potions. Because again, one of the differences between D&D miniatures games is that you don't use morale to say, okay, well my fighter is just done. He's freaked out. He's leaving. It's more or less the player looking at his sheet and going, I've only got like 3 hit points left. Somebody better help me, or we're either going to have to run or my character's dead. The problem with the class system, especially as it was presented in the earlier versions of D&D, is that it's very, very much cut and dry, very cut and paste, very this is your role in the group. And what I found happened a lot is that players, we want to finish that group. We got to have a full set of players of all types before we can go into a dungeon. Again, less about role play and more about rule play, and is really what it comes down to. So you join a group, it's like, well, I've been really thinking about this idea. I want to play something that's very similar to Mad Mardigan. Well, we really need a cleric. So sorry, buddy, you're going to have to play a cleric. That's where we're at. And that's where I find that very frustrating. And the game I'm going to use to represent this is almost exactly the opposite of what I said. It is a very modern game. It is Conan by Modiphius. Now, granted, 5th Ed has also done a lot to homogenize the classes and make them a little more egalitarian. But the thing I liked in Conan was the idea that you have a career, but that career barely defines you. It defines your history more than it defines what you're going to become. What's stopping you from becoming a mage? Probably your own superstitions about magic more than actually the ability to learn spells. Spells are also very minor in this game. This is a game where it is more sword and sorcery than fantasy, but it also feels more like it's a background thing and what gives you your abilities. And really, this game does a great job of making you role play over rule play, especially, and this is true with a lot of Modiphius' 2d20 games, their momentum and threat mechanic, which I can't sing highly enough about, because what it does for players is it gives you the ability to work as a team more effectively. Hey, I'm going to, and I just got a couple of points of momentum, and it's your turn. Hey, I can use that to kind of, to effectively, work off of your attack to take it to a greater advantage, which is a great system, and it really does inspire teamwork. I can't say enough good about that part of the game as well. But I think that, again, those careers in Conan, while there are plenty of them, they're nowhere near as defined and nowhere near as straight and narrow as they are in Dungeons and Dragons. Number 4, the just because rules. Now, this is kind of bouncing off of that first idea of the classes. One of the things that early D&D especially did, and I would say 3rd edition is really where this got fixed, and it's been fixed since, more or less, but it was such a pain in the ass, especially in those early games, was the idea of what I'm going to just call the just because rules. Things that were in the rules that you just had to observe with no logic behind them. A good example was, I want to play a wizard like Gandalf, sword in the air. Nope, no swords. You're a wizard. You don't know how to use a sword. Really, a sword should be pretty simple. I mean, just stick them with the pointy end. That's what they said in Game of Thrones, right? Yeah, but you're a wizard. You can't use it. Why not? Because you're a wizard. That's it. Well, what if I play a cleric and my cleric's god wields a sword as his holy weapon? His symbol is the sword. Enjoy using a mace or a club because that's what clerics use. Why? Just because. And that really didn't make much sense as a player. And it also, while it was, again, meant to help further divide those classes so that every class felt special, it does kind of ruin what a character is logically capable of. And it's a huge frustration. And I've heard players defend it to the hilt until about 3rd edition's release, at which point then it became kind of a moot point, because now a wizard can use a sword with a negative penalty, which I got to admit is 1,000 times smarter than, well, I can't use it. Why not? Just 'cause. It's just not allowed. And the game I think fixed this earliest on was probably Tunnels and Trolls. Tunnels and Trolls is the second role-playing game. It came out right after D&D, and it was really kind of meant as a response to what they found were the dumb parts of D&D, the things that the designers thought, you know, hey, D&D has a nugget of genius, but there's a lot wrong here too. In Tunnels and Trolls, you only have 3 classes, which are Fighter, Mage, and Rogue. But these classes are also more about imparting bonuses, not taking away. So as an example, yes, my wizard can use a sword, but he really sings in the fact that he starts with every first level spell. My fighter, yes, why would I want to play a fighter if the mage gets all these spells? Well, the mage gets all these spells, but the fighter gets a massive bonus to one style of attack. You know, I'm a really good swordsman, I get extra attack dice for that. The rogue is kind of a split between the two, not as good of a bonus, and he only gets 1 spell. So, you know, you have that kind of balance, but at the same time, there's nothing stopping your fighter from learning a spell other than, you know, his intelligence and wizardry and things that are already part of his character that you could improve over time. It's possible for a fighter to learn a spell, and just like it's possible for a wizard to have a decent chance with a sword. But they shine in these areas. And that takes away from that just because logic that just, again, was horrible. It's one of the things I will say, you know, in concession to D&D, they at least fixed that eventually, even if it took 2 editions to do so. Number 3, 0 to hero progression. This is another one that really just grinds my gears. Again, I understand the logic behind it, but it really is a pain in the ass. The idea is you start at level 1, you know, that kid who just left the farm, stored on his back in a dream, or that kid who just left the wizarding college and all you've got is a spell book with a couple of spells and hopes of fortune and glory. But by the time you hit 20th level, you are now a walking god. You have hundreds of hit points, tons of spells, tons of special powers, magic items, the whole 9 yards. And even when you go from level 1 to level 2, there's a great potential that you're going to almost double your hit points. Your combat effectiveness goes up markedly. And what this does is that it makes the game tougher for everyone. Now, I know a lot of players who like this. There's a dopamine rush to the idea of, hey, I just leveled up. And I've seen players who love their characters so much that when they really start getting into a campaign, they will map out all 20 levels. You know, they're only level 2 or 3, but they've already figured out that when they hit level 16, they're going to take this feat, and this feat. They're going to have this spell added. They're going to cross-class to this. Because, again, they're loving that progression, that building up of something great. At the same time, you know, that first level character fighting an orc is a challenge. That 8th level player facing an orc, it's like, you know, I've got more than enough hit points to absorb this chump, his attacks. He's nothing. So the GM now has to come up with greater threats. And this turns the game to a slog. The first time I tried running a level 20 based game, I just, and this was in 3rd ed, you know, so it was a sleeker system than the first 2. I just wanted to tear my hair out for how long combats were taking, because every time a monster would appear, they would have, you know, the players would spend, you know, 5 minutes looking through, like, well, I've got this spell, I've got this power, I've got this ability. And as GM, I had to do the same thing. Well, this dragon can do this, 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 and this, and this. And that really just turned combat into a crawl, a severe crawl, and it was just frustrating as hell. And that's really where I've kind of lost interest in that. And you've seen this, I've even heard of, you know, like, I think it was Professor Dungeon Master here on YouTube that talked about this as well, that, you know, how in module design, designers would have to come up with things to mitigate certain powers because, again, we're trying to keep drama, we're trying to keep tension going, and if you can walk through walls, then you know what's in that next room. So, boom, anti-magic field. And it's that kind of stuff that, again, takes away from the idea of roleplay and becomes more about, you know, let's spend 20 minutes arguing over some stupid rule. Now, the game that I think fixed this the best is Runequest. And to be honest, I could probably use that for a lot of these examples. Runequest is one of my favorite RPGs, especially in the fantasy genre. One of the things that Runequest does is character creation is you build an adventurer, and then as you advance, you don't advance through levels. You advance through, if you use the skill, you roll for a chance to improve that skill. So you're really only improving the things that you do in game. Now, that does mean that some players will immediately decide that, I'm going to go hack at something with a sword for no reason. Why? Well, I want to get my sword skill up. Yes, that's going to happen, but it's pretty minor by comparison. Also, this means that you're building your character as you go. You want to play a mage? Start reading spell books, dude. That's how you become a mage in Runequest. And that, plus the fact that these powers and abilities aren't really there like they are in D&D. Instead, you have your skills go up, your stats tend to stay the same. It's pretty tough to up a stat. It's pretty tough to up your hit points. So that minor threats are still minor threats. That means, or any threat is still the same level of threat for the most part. A character who's been playing for 2 years can still buy it with a couple of good arrow shots. So players have to think strategically. It's not just a matter of, well, let me pull out the catalog of powers that I've accumulated over the last 6 months of playing, and then I'm just going to lightning bolt him, send him to another dimension, blah, blah, blah. It's, okay, he's still a threat. Now, I've faced this threat before and have survived it. What can I take from that, and what tactics can I use? Which, again, I think draws players in a lot more than simply my list of powers. RQ is a great game. It's one I can't recommend enough, and this is a reason because of that. Number 2, predictability. There's an old saying that familiarity breeds contempt. And familiarity breeds a lot of things, including knowing things a little too well. You have a player, say, who is now facing a troll for the first time. Their character's never met one, never seen one. Well, what does the player do? Go for a torch. Why? Well, because said player has read the monster manual 100 times. And therein lies a problem, that fact that we all know these things, these factors, and this is, any popular RPG, you're going to have that. There's something fun about exploring and finding out these new things that just isn't there if you've, got all the info in hand. Some may call this metagaming, and there is certainly a part of it that's metagaming. At the same time, players may not even see them doing it as much as, just that reaction of, I know what this monster's capable of from my own research. And even other things, that spell has a 30-foot radius. I'm going to stand 35 feet away from the spell when it goes off. And those are the kind of things that can, again, turn a great game into a boring game. We also see this a lot in, like, the World of Darkness with these mysterious clans that everyone knows so well. Oh, you're a Nosferatu. That means you have, like, 0 charisma. Oh, you're a Toreador. I'll just put something pretty in front of you, and that'll distract you. Learning these weaknesses too early, and again, even subconsciously acting on that information causes a ton of problems for both game masters and players. You can also get stuck in kind of pre-judgmental states on these things. And honestly, the ability to shake that up is something that is desperately needed in a lot of games. Now, the game I think fixes this probably the best is Dungeon Crawl Classics by Goodman Games. This is also a retro clone of D&D, so it's going to feel super familiar to many players. However, it's where this game goes gonzo that really does matter. I think Polly Kidd actually described this best on her channel when she referred to it as basically a drunk dial love letter to Dungeons and Dragons. The thing about this game is that there's a lot of random charts. When you throw spells, you make a check, unlike D&D where those spells are automatic. And in that check, if you fail, weird stuff happens. So magic becomes a lot more unpredictable, which is a really cool example of this. The other thing is monsters have mutations. So yeah, it's an orc. I know orcs. I've dealt with orcs all my life. Yeah, but these orcs breathe fire. What? Yeah, they breathe fire. Crap. And that kind of stuff can really just totally goose a campaign. It can, make you not think about, wow, this is a new tactic, something I have to consider that I didn't have to consider before. Again, changing things up, throwing curveballs at your players, and in doing so in a pretty easy way. Honestly, that alone is well worth the price of admission, and is one of the reasons the book is as thick as it is. I mean, look at this thing. This is basically all 3 of your core books in one, but also most of it is those random charts. And again, drunken love letter to D&D is a good way to describe it, and it's worthwhile, especially I would think of any of the games on this list. One of the benefits is that this is closest to D&D. So if you are at least willing to try something outside of the realm of D&D, this is at least it without going too far off the beaten path. Number 1, too many cooks spoil the stew. This is one I totally understand from a marketing standpoint. Again, TSR was bought by Wizards of the Coast, was bought by Hasbro. Hasbro is a toy company that is used to making toys, and at a big scale. They're a billion-dollar industry. So again, somebody like, say, Steve Jackson Games sells 1 million copies of the Fantasy Trip, and it's time to dance in the streets and celebrate. If Hasbro doesn't sell 1 million of their new Snake Eyes action figure, or does just sell 1 million of their new Snake Eyes action figure, what the hell was wrong with him? What did we miss when we made this? That's kind of their mentality. And to be fair, making toys is a tooling cost, so it's a little different than printing a rule book, which is not as big a cost. One of the reasons that they keep TSR around, and also one of the reasons that they really don't mind the costs involved and the profit margins. But again, they're here to sell books. They're not here just to make a great game. They're a big enough industry, they're here to sell books. And to that end, and TSR did this too, we sell a lot of books. And with a lot of books comes a lot of supplements and a lot of power creep. Adding new classes, adding new feats, adding new abilities, adding new kits. And these are all terms they have used at one edition or another. It's always that whole, here's all these new things. We have Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Why? Because we want to add more material, which almost makes this a collectible rule set. And as a GM, it's a huge problem when your players have found something that they've got to use, and you did not run out and buy that book yet. And you can say, ha, the GM doesn't have the money to buy all the books. It's not even that. It's a matter of keeping up with those books. Or having to read everything just to run a simple scenario. And players, when they have these extra books, will look for the oddball shit. They will look for that crazy combination, players who will never play a standard human fighter, but instead will have to play a, Demogorgon Wraith Snatcher, because that's in a supplement and we gotta play it, and I got these extra feats. That also slows the game down, becomes a problem when either A, if I don't have the books, I have to go get them, or B, I have the books and now have to spend my time finding out exactly what they can and can't do. And that really does destroy a lot of the fun. And it's not so much about building options, it's about, again, selling books. That's how they make money. And in doing so, again, it can turn a simple game, D&D is super easy. Yes, at its basic level, it's super easy. But when you start adding on these layers, it becomes a lot more complex and a lot more problematic for any dungeon master. So the game I'm going to use to hit this last point is Forbidden Lands by Free League, or Freeligian, a Swedish RPG. This is actually one of 2 fantasy RPGs they make. There are other RPGs I could have also used here, but I'm using this one because I rather like it and I've just been recently getting into it. What it does is that everything you need is in that box. The game is about exploration, and it doesn't have any supplements so far that really go into, here's a bunch of new classes, here's a bunch of new races, here's a bunch of new abilities. And the thing about that is that when you have players who are doing the whole, pick and choose, cherry pick from 15 supplements to make their character, be different for different sake, it becomes a pain in the ass. And in this game, you can play a great character, you can have a great story without all that extra work, without all that extra trudging through 15 books to find every little thing. And this is a great example of that. They do some great adventures, and the game really does focus on the idea of exploration. And I think that's one of its strongest points, and something I would really recommend trying just for that very reason. In conclusion, yes, Dungeons & Dragons really has done a lot for the hobby. As the first RPG, it sparked a lot of imagination. And I don't want to take away from that. I don't want everyone to think, this is just somebody who hates on something that's popular or hates on something that's good. It's also the fact that, again, with that strength, with that popularity, there is a dark side. There is a bad side of it too. There are things that they have done wrong or haven't done as well as other games. And that's it. There's a lot of great people out there in this hobby, a lot of great designers who've come with some amazing designs. In fact, a lot of what you see in the evolution of D&D is really kind of playing catch up from other games. I remember several people remarking in the Runequest community after seeing Third Ed that it's like, wow, after years of people saying that D&D was a better game, Third Ed feels an awful lot like Runequest with its with its focus on allowing you to do things that weren't just because. And so yeah, there is a lot to say good about D&D, but I also feel like it's important to kind of, for everyone, to broaden their horizons, try something different. I know it can be tough, especially if you're not used to it, and it seems like an investment to buy a rule book, read it, try a whole alien system. But at the same time, there are a lot of amazing writers out there, a lot of amazing creators who've done a lot of amazing things, and some of them will eventually end up in another edition of D&D anyway. So why not give them a try? Why not expand your horizons? Again, variety is the spice of life. And with that, all I can say is happy gaming.